Very few Canadians are aware of the history of Indian hospitals, which operated from the 1930s to the 1980s. Before Indian hospitals, Indians were not welcome in hospitals except for a few that provided a separate Indian wing, which was usually in the basement. But once the medical professionals started using the term Indian tuberculosis to describe a deadly disease, the segregation of Indians in the medical system got worse, and separate Indian hospitals were established. At first, when First Nations communities heard that they were going to have special hospitals, they thought this was the government's way of taking care of the treaty responsibility for health care. The government told everyone that Indian hospitals were going to keep Canadians safe from exposure to Indian tuberculosis. When the government opened the first two Indian hospitals, they realized they could operate for half the cost of other community hospitals, so they decided to expand the Indian hospitals. Some of the Indian hospitals were just unused military barracks that did not have proper kitchens, laundry, and maintenance. Many times there was just one big open space where men, women, and children were all put together with no privacy, and they were overcrowded. The buildings were in need of major repairs, and there was a constant fear of fires. Doctors did not want to work in remote, underfunded hospitals, so the majority of the staff was poorly trained healthcare workers. There were high rates of tuberculosis with First Nation children in residential schools because of malnutrition, overcrowding, and lack of heat made it the perfect place for the disease to spread. Children who showed signs of the disease were sent to the Indian hospitals, and when they recovered, they were sent back to the residential school. This arrangement meant that both the residential school and Indian hospital could continue operating because they both needed a certain number of people to receive government funds. At the time, Indians were not even considered persons, and they were definitely not considered citizens. Under the Indian Act, it was legal for Indian agents, doctors, and other government agents to apprehend Indians they suspected were contagious with a disease and force them into quarantine. An interesting fact, that part of the Indian Act remains today. Indian hospitals provided a steady supply of subjects that could be used for medical and nutritional experiments. Children were used to test potential vaccines for tuberculosis and subject to electric shock to see that it might be a cure. Patients reported having a lung surgically removed, which meant that their ribs were cut off at their spine. Some of the surgeries happened after the medical system already knew that drugs could cure tuberculosis. Patients were left emotionally and physically damaged for life. In the 1940s and the 1950s, people getting treated for tuberculosis could take medication at home and not have to go into the hospital, but not for Indigenous patients. They were sent to Indian hospitals for years at a time because it was said that they were not capable of their own care at home like non-Indigenous patients. This meant the hospitals could continue to be funded by the government because they had enough patients. Patients were not allowed to leave Indian hospitals for any reason. The Indian Act was amended in 1953 to include the Indian Health Regulations that made it a crime for Indigenous people to refuse to see a doctor or go to a hospital, and to leave the hospital before being discharged. The RCMP arrested patients and returned them to hospitals or sent them to jail. However, the government would not return those who died at an Indian hospital to their communities unless the family paid the costs. Many were buried at the near cemetery in unmarked graves, forever lost to their families. On January 25, 2018, former patients of the Indian hospitals filed a $1.1 billion class action lawsuit against the federal government. They are seeking financial compensation and a formal acknowledgement of the government's negligence in the operation of Indian hospitals.